In this video, we are going to take a look at how we can implement multiple reducers in Redux. Let's go ahead and look at how we can implement multiple reducers using our CounterJS example. I'm going to go ahead and implement a to-do reducer, which doesn't really make much sense in the context of our counter example, but it will help demonstrate how we can use multiple reducers, all of which do different things within our application. Let's go ahead and start by adding the required HTML for our new to-do reducer. I'm going to go ahead and create a div with the class of container. And within this div, I'm going to have a UL with an ID of to-do list. And this is going to display lots of LIs for our to-dos. I'm then going to have another div within which I'm going to have an input. This input is going to be of type text. It's going to have a placeholder of enter a task, and it's going to have an ID of to do. And that's where we're going to add the text for our to-dos. We're then of course going to have 3 buttons in the same way we do as the example above. Just copy those rather than typing it all out. And we're going to have a new button with the ID of new, a delete button with the ID of delete, and a button with delete all with the ID of delete all. Just going to go ahead and change these colors. So we'll make the new one green, we'll make the delete blue, and then the delete all red. Now we've got all the HTML for our new reducer, we can go ahead and start to look at the JavaScript. So heading back over to counter.js. The first thing I'm going to do is just rename this CounterReducer to actually call it CounterReducer. This will just make things slightly more clear when we add our to-do reducer. And that's all we need to do to update the name of our CounterReducer. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just create our to-do reducer. This should be nice and easy now. We should know how to create a reducer. So we'll go ahead and call this to-dos reducer. And of course our reducer takes our state and an action. And of course, as we know, it is simply just a function. We are going to use the best practice of initializing our state in the start of the reducer, just so that if we don't pass anything in, we can go ahead and initialize our state, as we saw in the last video. So we're going to go ahead and simply return an object of to-dos, which is going to be an empty array. Now we've initialized our state, let's just go ahead and boilerplate out our switch statement. Of course, we're going to switch on the actions type, and we're going to have a few cases. So we're going to have a case of new, so when we create a new to do, and we are going to return our next state. We're going to have a case of delete, and again we are simply going to return our next state. Obviously we'll fill these in a bit, and we're going to have a case of delete all. This one's nice and easy, we can actually do this one now. So we can have our next state dot to-dos equals a blank array, and then we can just simply return our next state. And I've just remembered I haven't got a break at the end of these, which I need to have. There we go. And of course we will have our default, and we will simply return our state. Let me just format this a little bit. Okay. Excellent. So we've got the boilerplate for our new to-dos reducer. So we have a case of a new action, a delete action, and a delete all action. Let's go ahead and sort out our NextState object. So let's go ahead and create an object called NextState. We're going to take that object and we're going to use object.assign. If you're not familiar with this, all this does is it creates a new object, passing in whatever we want from an old object. So essentially we're just cloning an object and getting a new object back. And this will help us with the immutability of our reducer, because as we know, we don't want to mutate the state, we want to return a new state. And this is what this is doing. So we can't do next state equals state.todos, for example, because arrays are objects in JavaScript and JavaScript objects are passed by reference, not value. So if we did this and then we updated nextState.todos, for example, we would actually be mutating the original state, and we don't want to do that. So all this is doing is it's creating a new object using object.assign. It's taking the state object and cloning it into our new object and then assigning that to nextState. So we end up with a new object in our nextState variable, which is exactly the same as our old state. And that would just allow us to keep immutability and to keep our to-dos reducer as a pure function, which, as we know, is something we have to do in Redux. Okay, let's go ahead and just finish off our switch statement. So all we're going to do in our new case is we can take our next state and we're going to take the to-dos array and we're simply going to push in our action.payload, and we'll come to that in a bit. All this is going to do is essentially just add a new to-do to our to-dos array and then return the next state. For our delete action, we're going to take our next state to-dos array and we're simply going to pop off the end of the array. So we're just going to delete an item from the end of the array. And that is our to-dos reducer complete. We of course need to create the actions for that reducer and somehow get it into our store to get Redux to understand we have this reducer and to know to use it. So let's go ahead and boilerplate out our actions. Should be nice and easy. We've just got 3 actions. So we're going to have our document, we're going to get our element by ID, and we're going to pass in the ID new. This is obviously for our new to do, and we're going to add an event listener for click, and we're going to pass a callback function, and in this function we are simply going to dispatch, as we know, an object with a type of new, and this time we're going to pass in a payload. Now this is actually a best practice, so whenever you have actions you should always have a payload. Well, if you're going to have something passed in with that action, you should have a payload. Obviously for our counter reducer, all we're doing is just incrementing or decrementing our count, so we don't have the concept of a payload. But for our to-dos reducer, we are going to have a concept of a payload, because we are obviously going to input some text into our input box. We're going to add a to-do, and that to-do text is going to be our payload. We'll get back to that in a bit. Let's just go ahead and copy this twice, create our delete and delete all actions as well. So we're going to have delete, and it's going to be on the action delete, and we're not going to pass in a payload because all we're doing there is we're just removing the last item from the array. And of course we're going to have a delete all, and the action type is delete all. And again, we don't need a payload for that action, for that dispatch, because all we're doing is just going to reset that to-dos array to a blank array. Okay, so the next thing we should do is actually get the to-dos input element and the to-dos list element, and this will allow us to have our payload down here, because obviously that's empty at the moment. So let's go ahead and just select those elements, and then we'll come on to how we use multiple reducers in a second. So just under our counter element, let's go ahead and create a new variable called to-do input. And this is going to be document.get element by ID. And I believe it is to-dos. It might be to-do. We'll have to double check that. And we're going to have another one called to-dos list, which is going to be document.get element by ID of to-dos list. Let's just check that I've got those IDs correct. So that's ID to do, should be to dos, and that's to do list. Excellent. So now we've got those elements selected, we can go ahead and actually add in our payload. So our payload is simply going to be the value of this input. It's really quite simple. I'm sure you know what's going on here. It's plain old JavaScript, nice and simple. So it's going to be our to-dos input dot value, and that's just going to be the text of the input that the user puts in, so our new to-do. So before we go any further, let's actually get our to-dos reducer working so we can see that the reducer itself is working. And to do that, we're going to need to create a render function for that. So at the moment we have our counter render, and that just adds the text to the HTML. I'm just going to comment that out because we're not going to use that for the moment, obviously, because we're just going to have our single to-dos reducer, and that's going to be working, and then we'll combine the counter reducer and the to-dos reducer together and see how that works. So in our render function, just preemptively, I'm just going to go ahead and call a function called render list. And this is going to render our to-dos list. And I'm going to pass in the state. Let's just go ahead and create that function called render list. And it takes the state as an argument. So the first thing I'm going to do in this function, I'm going to take our to-dos list, take the inner HTML, and I'm just going to set it to blank. So that to-dos list is our UL. So every time we call an action, I just want to set the entire list to just a blank string. So in other words, we're just going to delete all the LIs that are in that list. That will just mean that whenever we call a new action, it will just loop through the to-dos array and add those in. So we don't need to worry about deleting stuff. The render list will just render whatever's in the array. Next thing we're going to do is just going to use a for loop. So for index I, we're going to have our state dot to-dos, and that's going to be our to-dos array. We've got our element here. We're going to go ahead and create a list element. So document dot create element. Element is an li. Going to go ahead and get our to-dos array. So state dot to-dos. Missed a space out there. I'm going to set the inner HTML to equal to-dos dot to string, and I missed out the I there. And we're going to go ahead and append that li element to our to-dos list. Okay, let me just explain what's going on here. So in our render list function, we initially just set our UL to be blank, have no LIs in it. We then iterate over our state.todos array. We create our list element. Don't actually need that there. So we create our list element, which is just going to be a blank li. We then get our current to do, which should be singular. It's only one to do. So we get the first to do. We then put that first to do as a string into the HTML, into the li, into that list element, and then we append that list element to our UL. So all we're doing there is just iterating through the array, creating a list element with the text of our to do, and putting that list element into our UL in the DOM. Nice and simple. I don't think I explained that very well, but it's quite a simple thing, and you'll see how it works in a second. So with that render done, we should just need to pass in our to-dos reducer to our store. And now, in theory, provided I've not made any mistakes, we should just be able to add a task. Oh, I've obviously made an error. To-dos input is not defined. Number 99. To-dos input. Oh, it's to-do input. To-dos input. Okay, that should have fixed that. Okay, excellent. So you can see now that we can add new tasks, we can delete tasks, and we can delete all. So as I mentioned, this is just going to be done in our render list function, just renders a new list of li elements. So as we can see, our to-dos reducer works now, but our counter reducer doesn't work, obviously because it's not passed in to our store. Okay, so I think you've probably heard me waffle on enough now. So let's go ahead and combine our reducers, get our multiple reducers working in our Redux application. And this is actually just really, really simple. So when we actually create our Redux store, as you know, we pass in our reducer. Now, unfortunately, you can't just pass in more reducers like so. That won't work. You can only pass in one reducer at a time like that. But what we can do is we can use a Redux method called combine reducers. And this method simply takes an object, and this object has a name of a reducer. So we're going to have CounterReducer, and then it simply has the reducer itself. So you pass in an object with the name of the reducer and then the reducer itself. So we could just call that counter if we wanted to, but I'm just going to keep it as CounterReducer. And then you simply pass in the to-dos reducer as well. So you can pass in as many reducers as you like once you use combine reducers. You simply pass in an object with a key, the name of the reducer, and then the reducer object itself, the reducer function itself. And that's it. That should mean that our counter reducer and our to-dos reducer work in the same application. Let's just go ahead and uncomment our rendering for our counter reducer. Save that, head on back over to the browser, refresh, and we've got an error. So cannot read toString of undefined. Okay, I have forgotten to do something. So before, when we had just a single reducer, we had our state, and then we just had a count property on that state. But we now have two reducers. So we now have a counter reducer and our to-dos reducer. So our state now has two objects, two functions. So it's now going to be state.counterReducer.count, and it's going to be state.todos reducer.todos, and let's just copy that again down there. So you just need to make sure that you are selecting the correct reducer, and I'll display that object in a second so you can see what it's like. So hopefully that should have fixed the error, and it has by the looks of it. So we now have our original counter reducer, and we can add, we can minus, and we can reset that. And we have a to-dos reducer, so we can have pay bills, something no one likes doing, and there we go. We add in our new task, and we can add lots of those tasks, and we can delete those tasks. Obviously the UI is not great because obviously every time you add or delete, it jumps about a bit, and then we can delete all. But you can see that it's actually really simple to add multiple reducers. I spent a lot of the time in this video just building the new reducer, but actually combining those reducers and getting Redux to work with multiple reducers is really, really simple. You just have to use the combine reducers function. And all you do is just pass in an object that contains your reducers. And as I said, you can call this property whatever you want. You call this key whatever you want. You can call it, we could call it count or counter or whatever. But I find it easier to just call it the same as the reducer itself. And when you move on to ES6, which we'll do later on, you'll see why that's just an easier way to do it. So that's it. It's actually really simple to have multiple reducers. So using combine reducers, we have easily created a Redux application that has two reducers, two completely separate reducers, and it's actually quite easy. It just takes time to build the reducer, which, as you know, is actually quite easy once you break it all down into separate elements. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment, and I'll catch you in the next video.